Have you ever studied English for years, but still feel nervous when native speakers talk to you? Do you understand grammar rules but struggle to keep a simple conversation going? If that sounds familiar, this lesson is for you. Today, you will learn practical English expressions that native speakers use every day in real conversations. These are not complicated phrases from textbooks. They are simple, natural, and incredibly useful in daily life, at work, with friends, and in social situations. By the end of this lesson, you will know how to start conversations confidently, respond naturally, handle uncertainty, show empathy, keep conversations flowing, and end interactions like a native speaker. Welcome to Easy Listening English, the channel where you improve your English naturally through stories, real-life conversations, and easy listening practice. My name is Linda, and today I'll guide you through some of the most useful English phrases you can start using immediately. So relax, listen carefully, and try to repeat the expressions with me. The more you hear them, the more natural they will become. Now let's get started. Hello everyone. Welcome back to Easy Listening English, the channel where you improve your English naturally through stories, real-life conversations, and easy listening practice. My name is Linda, and today I'll guide you through some of the most useful English phrases you can start using immediately. So relax, listen carefully, and try to repeat the expressions with me. The more you hear them, the more natural they will become. Now let's get started. Hi, my name is Linda. How's it going? I'm 28 years old, and I live in a busy city where every day feels a little different from the one before. I work in a marketing company, and I spend most of my weekdays talking to clients, attending meetings, and working on new projects. Even though my schedule can be quite busy, I always try to make time for meaningful conversations with people around me. I believe that a good conversation can brighten someone's day, and it can also help build strong relationships. That is why I enjoy learning natural English expressions that people actually use in daily life. This morning started like most mornings for me. I woke up early, made a cup of coffee, and checked a few emails before heading to work. The weather was pleasant, and I felt pretty good about the day ahead. As I walked into the office building, I saw one of my coworkers standing near the entrance. Instead of asking the usual, "How are you?" I smiled and said, "How's it going?" He smiled back immediately and replied, "Pretty good. How about you?" The conversation felt relaxed and friendly, and it made the start of the day feel much more natural. One thing I have noticed is that simple greetings can have a powerful effect. When people hear a friendly expression, they often feel more comfortable and open. In the past, I used to rely on textbook phrases, but now I try to sound more natural. For example, when I meet my close friends, I often ask, "What's up?" It feels casual and easygoing. Most of the time they answer with something simple like, "Not much, just chilling," or "Nothing special." Those short exchanges may seem small, but they help create a warm atmosphere. A few days ago, I met my friend Sarah at a coffee shop after work. I arrived first and found a table near the window. When she walked in, she waved at me and said, "Hey Linda, what's up?" I laughed and answered, "Not much, just chilling after a long day." We both smiled because the conversation felt natural from the very beginning. Instead of forcing formal language, we were simply enjoying each other's company. That small moment reminded me how useful casual expressions can be in everyday life. I think many language learners focus heavily on grammar and vocabulary, which are certainly important. However, real conversations often depend on comfort and connection rather than perfection. People rarely analyze every word when they're talking with friends. They simply want to communicate and enjoy the interaction. That is why phrases like, "How's it going?" and "What's up?" are so valuable. They help break the ice and make conversations feel less intimidating. At work, I have also seen how these expressions can improve communication. Last week, I was waiting for an important meeting to begin. Several team members were already in the conference room, looking at their laptops and preparing notes. The atmosphere felt a little serious, so I decided to lighten the mood. I walked in and said, "Hey, everyone, how's it going?" A few people smiled immediately. Someone answered, "Pretty good," while another person said, "Not bad." Within seconds, the room felt more relaxed. Building relationships is something that matters to me. Whether I am talking to coworkers, friends, neighbors, or even new acquaintances, I want people to feel comfortable around me. I have learned that communication is not only about sharing information. It is also about creating a connection. A simple greeting can signal friendliness, respect, and openness. It can encourage the other person to engage more actively in the conversation. Yesterday evening, I went to a local bookstore after work. While I was browsing through a section of travel books, I noticed a woman looking at the same shelf. We reached for the same book at almost the same time and we both laughed. I smiled and said, "How's it going?" She smiled back and said, "Pretty good." We ended up talking for several minutes about travel destinations and favorite books. What started as a brief greeting turned into an enjoyable conversation. Moments like that make me appreciate the value of everyday language. Sometimes people think that communication must be complex to be meaningful. In reality, some of the best conversations begin with very simple words. A friendly greeting can open the door to new friendships, professional connections, or memorable experiences. It can help people feel seen and acknowledged. Another thing I enjoy is observing how different people respond to greetings. Some people answer with enthusiasm, while others prefer short responses. When I ask, "How's it going?" I might hear "Great," "Pretty good," "Not bad," or even "Busy as always." Each response gives me a small glimpse into their day. It helps me understand their mood and decide how to continue the conversation. As someone who interacts with many people throughout the week, I have come to appreciate these subtle social skills. They may seem minor, but they make communication smoother and more enjoyable. Every time I choose a natural greeting, I feel more confident. I also notice that other people respond more positively. The exchange feels genuine rather than scripted. One of my goals this year is to become an even better communicator. I want to listen more carefully, speak more naturally, and build stronger connections with the people around me. Learning conversational expressions is an important part of that journey. The more I practice them, the more comfortable they become. Eventually, they start to feel like a natural part of who I am. So if you ever meet me in a hallway, at a coffee shop, in a meeting room, or even while waiting for a bus, there is a good chance I will greet you with a smile and say, "How's it going?" It is a simple phrase, but it carries a friendly message. It says that I am open to conversation and interested in connecting with you. And if you ask me the same question, I will probably smile and reply, "Pretty good." That is how many great conversations begin, one simple greeting at a time. After spending more time learning how to start conversations naturally, I began paying attention to what happened after the greeting. I noticed that many conversations did not stop at "How's it going?" Instead, they quickly moved toward invitations, suggestions, and plans. As a result, I realized that knowing how to respond positively was just as important as knowing how to start a conversation. A friendly greeting could open the door, but agreement and enthusiasm helped keep the conversation moving forward. That was a lesson I learned through many everyday experiences. One Friday afternoon, I was finishing some work at my desk when my coworker Sarah walked over with a smile. She had been working hard all week, and I could tell she was looking forward to the weekend. She asked if I wanted to join a few colleagues for dinner after work. Without hesitation, I smiled and said, "That sounds good." Her face immediately lit up. It was a simple response, but it showed that I was interested and willing to participate. The conversation felt positive from the very beginning. As the day continued, more people joined the discussion. Someone suggested trying a new restaurant downtown. Another person recommended a place near the river. Everyone had different opinions, but the atmosphere remained friendly because people responded positively to one another. Instead of criticizing suggestions, we encouraged them. When someone mentioned a restaurant that sounded interesting, I said, "Sounds great." The phrase was short, but it helped maintain a cooperative mood. People felt comfortable sharing ideas because they knew they would be heard. I have learned that enthusiasm can be contagious. When one person responds positively, others often do the same. A simple phrase like, "That sounds good," can create momentum in a conversation. It signals openness and interest. It tells the other person that their idea has value. In many situations, that small encouragement can make a big difference. Whether at work or with friends, positive responses help strengthen relationships. Later that evening, our group finally decided where to go. After discussing several options, everyone agreed on a restaurant near the city center. The decision-making process had been smooth because people were willing to cooperate. When the final choice was made, one of my coworkers smiled and said, "Sounds like a plan." I immediately nodded and repeated the phrase. It felt like the perfect way to confirm that everything was settled. There was no confusion, no uncertainty, just a clear agreement that everyone understood. The more I used these expressions, the more natural they became. At first, I had to think about them consciously. I would pause for a moment before speaking. Over time, however, they started coming automatically. When someone suggested grabbing coffee, I would say, "Sounds great." When a friend invited me to a movie, I would answer, "That sounds good." These phrases became part of my everyday communication style. They helped me sound friendly, approachable, and engaged. A few weeks later, I experienced another situation that reinforced this lesson. My friend Emma called me on a Saturday morning. She told me about a weekend art festival taking place nearby. She sounded excited and asked if I wanted to go with her. As she described the event, I could hear the enthusiasm in her voice. Without even thinking, I responded, "That sounds great." The phrase matched my genuine reaction. I was interested in the idea, and I wanted her to know it. During the festival, we walked through different exhibits, listened to live music, and talked with local artists. It turned out to be one of the most enjoyable weekends I had experienced in months. At one point, Emma laughed and reminded me that I almost never regret saying yes to new experiences. Looking back, I realized she was right. Many memorable moments begin with a positive response. Sometimes all it takes is being willing to say, "That sounds good." Positive communication does not mean agreeing with everything. Instead, it means showing respect for ideas and maintaining a constructive attitude. Even when I am unsure about a suggestion, I try to acknowledge the effort behind it. People appreciate feeling heard. They appreciate knowing that their opinions matter. By responding positively, I create a space where conversations can develop naturally and comfortably. At work, this skill has been especially valuable. During meetings, team members often present new ideas and strategies. Not every idea becomes part of the final project, but positive language helps everyone stay motivated. When a colleague shares a proposal, saying, "That sounds good," encourages further discussion. It creates an environment where people feel confident enough to contribute. Over time, I have noticed that teams communicate more effectively when members support each other's ideas before evaluating them. One afternoon, my manager introduced a new project that required collaboration between several departments. The timeline was ambitious, and the workload seemed challenging. Some people looked concerned. Others remained quiet. I decided to focus on the opportunity rather than the difficulty. I smiled and said, "Sounds like a plan." A few coworkers laughed softly, and the tension in the room eased. The phrase did not solve every problem, but it helped shift the mood toward action and cooperation. Outside of work, these expressions have improved my friendships as well. Friends often invite one another to activities, share recommendations, or discuss future plans. Positive responses keep those interactions enjoyable. They show appreciation for the effort someone makes when extending an invitation. Nobody likes feeling ignored or dismissed. A simple phrase can reassure people that their ideas are welcome. As I continued developing my communication skills, I discovered that agreement often leads to stronger connections. When people feel supported, they become more comfortable sharing their thoughts. Conversations become richer, more engaging, and more meaningful. Positive language acts like a bridge between people. It creates trust and encourages collaboration. By the end of that year, I found myself using these expressions almost every day. They appeared in conversations with coworkers, friends, family members, and even new acquaintances. The phrases were simple, yet they carried a powerful message. They communicated interest, respect, and willingness to participate. Most importantly, they helped transform ordinary conversations into positive experiences. Of course, life is not always straightforward. Sometimes people ask questions that I cannot answer immediately. Sometimes invitations conflict with my schedule. Sometimes I need more information before making a decision. In those moments, I cannot always respond with a confident yes. Instead, I need a different set of expressions that allow me to remain polite while I think things through. And that is where the next stage of communication begins. As much as I enjoy saying yes to exciting opportunities, I have learned that life does not always allow immediate answers. There are times when I need more information before making a decision. There are moments when my schedule is already full, or when I simply do not know enough about a situation to respond confidently. In the past, I sometimes felt pressured to give an answer right away. I worried that hesitation might make me seem uninterested or unprepared. Over time, however, I discovered that uncertainty is a normal part of communication. What matters is knowing how to express it clearly and politely. One Monday morning, shortly after arriving at the office, my manager approached my desk with a question. She was organizing a client presentation for the following week and needed someone to assist with several important tasks. After briefly explaining the project, she asked whether I would be available to join the preparation team. I wanted to help because the project sounded interesting. At the same time, I remembered that I already had several deadlines approaching. Instead of giving an answer that I might regret later, I smiled and said, "I'm not sure." The phrase was honest and professional. It communicated my uncertainty without sounding negative. My manager appreciated the response. Rather than assuming I was refusing the opportunity, she understood that I needed time to evaluate my availability. She nodded and asked me to check my schedule before the end of the day. I immediately replied, "Let me check." Those 3 words gave me the time I needed. They allowed me to gather information before making a commitment. More importantly, they showed that I was taking the request seriously. After reviewing my calendar, I realized that I could adjust a few tasks and make room for the new project. Later that afternoon, I returned to my manager's office and confirmed my participation. The conversation ended positively because I had taken the time to verify the facts. That experience taught me that saying, "I'm not sure," is not a weakness. In many situations, it is actually the most responsible answer. I started noticing similar situations outside of work as well. One evening, my friend Emma sent me a message asking if I wanted to join a weekend hiking trip. Normally, I enjoy outdoor activities, but I remembered that my cousin might be visiting that weekend. Unfortunately, I had not yet received final confirmation. Instead of accepting or declining immediately, I replied, "I'm not sure yet." Then I added, "Let me check and I'll get back to you." Emma understood perfectly. There was no pressure and no misunderstanding. The next day, after speaking with my cousin, I finally knew my plans. Since the visit had been postponed, I was free to join the hiking trip. I sent Emma another message and confirmed that I could come. She thanked me for letting her know. That simple exchange reminded me how useful uncertainty phrases can be. They help prevent confusion and allow conversations to remain open until all the necessary information is available. Another expression that has become part of my daily communication is "let me know." I use it in both personal and professional situations. It is one of those phrases that sounds simple, yet it carries an important message. It tells the other person that I am interested in receiving future updates. It keeps the communication channel open and active. A good example happened during a group project at work. One of my colleagues was waiting for approval from a client before moving forward with an important task. Since the decision would affect several team members, everyone wanted to stay informed. Before leaving the office that evening, I told him, "Let me know when you hear back from them." The phrase communicated my interest without creating unnecessary pressure. It simply invited future communication. A few days later, he received the approval and immediately updated the team. Because we had stayed connected, everyone was able to move forward efficiently. Experiences like that have shown me how valuable clear communication can be. As I gained more confidence in using these expressions, I noticed a change in the way I approached conversations. I no longer felt uncomfortable admitting uncertainty. Instead, I viewed it as a natural part of decision-making. Nobody knows everything at every moment. Everyone occasionally needs time to think, research, verify, or reflect. Acknowledging that reality actually makes communication more honest. One particularly memorable situation happened during a family gathering. My relatives were discussing plans for a large reunion later in the year. Several possible dates were being considered, and everyone wanted quick answers. One of my uncles asked whether I would be available during a specific weekend. I checked my memory, but could not remember if I already had plans. Rather than guessing, I simply said, "I'm not sure. Let me check my calendar." Nobody seemed bothered by the response. In fact, several other family members ended up doing the same thing. That moment made me realize how often people appreciate honesty. Most individuals would rather receive an accurate answer later than an uncertain answer immediately. By admitting when I do not know something, I avoid creating confusion and unrealistic expectations. It is a small habit, but it has improved many of my relationships. Communication is not always about certainty. Sometimes it is about managing uncertainty in a respectful way. Expressions like, "I'm not sure," "let me check," and "let me know" allow conversations to continue without forcing immediate decisions. They create space for thought, verification, and follow-up. They help people remain connected while waiting for answers. As the months passed, these phrases became second nature to me. I used them in meetings, text messages, phone calls, and casual conversations. They helped me sound calm, thoughtful, and organized. Most importantly, they reminded me that good communication is not about pretending to know everything. It is about being honest, clear, and considerate of others. Of course, even after checking information and confirming plans, things do not always go perfectly. Sometimes schedules change unexpectedly. Sometimes mistakes happen. People arrive late, forget tasks, or encounter problems they never anticipated. In those situations, communication takes on a different role. Instead of expressing uncertainty, it becomes a tool for reassurance, understanding, and empathy. And that is where the next chapter of my journey begins. As I continued improving my communication skills, I realized that not every conversation revolves around plans, decisions, or schedules. Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes things go wrong despite everyone's best intentions. In those moments, the most important skill is not giving answers or making decisions. Instead, it is knowing how to respond with understanding and empathy. I gradually learned that a few simple phrases could reduce tension, repair misunderstandings, and help people feel comfortable again. One Tuesday morning, I arrived at work ready to start an important project. Our team had been preparing for a client presentation for several weeks, and everyone was working hard to meet the deadline. Shortly after I sat down at my desk, one of my coworkers approached me with a worried expression. He looked nervous and hesitant. Before I could ask what was wrong, he explained that he had accidentally sent an outdated file to one of our clients. I could see that he felt terrible about the mistake. His voice was quiet, and he kept apologizing. In the past, I might have focused immediately on the problem itself. However, I had learned that people often need reassurance before they can focus on solutions. I smiled and said, "No worries." The moment those words left my mouth, his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. He knew I was not angry, and that made it easier for him to think clearly. We reviewed the situation together and quickly realized that the mistake could be corrected. The client had not yet started reviewing the document, so there was still time to send the correct version. As we worked through the issue, I repeated, "Don't worry about it. We can fix this." Those words were not meant to ignore the problem. They were meant to reduce unnecessary stress. When people feel supported, they are often better able to solve problems effectively. That experience reminded me that everyone makes mistakes. No matter how organized, intelligent, or experienced someone may be, errors happen. What truly matters is how people respond afterward. A supportive response can transform a stressful situation into a manageable one. It encourages teamwork and trust. It reminds people that mistakes do not define them. A few weeks later, I experienced a similar situation outside of work. My friend Emma and I had planned to meet for lunch on Saturday afternoon. We had agreed on a time and location several days earlier. I arrived at the restaurant a little early and found a table near the window. 20 minutes passed, and Emma still had not arrived. Eventually, my phone rang. She sounded embarrassed as she explained that heavy traffic had delayed her far longer than expected. Before she could finish apologizing, I said, "No worries." I genuinely meant it. Traffic was beyond her control, and there was no reason to make her feel worse. She thanked me and promised to arrive as soon as possible. When she finally joined me, the conversation remained relaxed because there was no lingering tension. A simple phrase had prevented a small inconvenience from becoming a larger issue. Another expression that became increasingly useful in my daily life was, "That makes sense." At first glance, it seems like a very simple statement. However, I discovered that it has a powerful effect on conversations. People want to feel understood. They want to know that their reasoning has been heard and considered. Saying, "That makes sense," communicates understanding without necessarily agreeing with every detail. One afternoon, my younger brother called me to explain why he could not attend a family dinner. He had recently started a new job and was facing several important deadlines. As he described his workload, I could hear the frustration in his voice. He was disappointed that he would miss the gathering. After listening carefully, I replied, "That makes sense." Immediately, he sounded relieved. He no longer felt the need to defend his decision because he knew I understood his situation. Moments like that taught me an important lesson about empathy. People are not always looking for advice. Sometimes they simply want acknowledgement. They want someone to listen and recognize their perspective. A phrase like "that makes sense" can provide exactly that. It shows respect for another person's experience. It tells them that their feelings and reasoning are valid. I started using these expressions more often in both personal and professional settings. During meetings, coworkers occasionally explained delays or unexpected challenges. Instead of reacting with frustration, I would listen carefully and respond. That makes sense. The phrase encouraged open communication. People felt comfortable discussing problems because they knew they would be met with understanding rather than immediate criticism. One memorable example occurred during a major project at work. A teammate was responsible for gathering data from several departments. Unfortunately, some of the information arrived much later than expected. As a result, certain parts of the project were delayed. During our team meeting, she explained the situation and apologized repeatedly. After hearing the details, I said, "That makes sense." Several others nodded in agreement. The conversation shifted away from blame and toward finding solutions. The more I practiced empathy, the more I noticed its effect on relationships. Friends became more open with me. Coworkers trusted me more. Family members felt comfortable sharing concerns and frustrations. Empathy created an atmosphere where people felt safe expressing themselves honestly. It strengthened connections in ways that technical skills or perfect grammar never could. Of course, empathy does not mean ignoring problems. It does not mean pretending that mistakes have no consequences. Instead, it means addressing difficulties while still treating people with kindness and respect. A calm response helps people focus on solutions. A supportive attitude encourages accountability without creating unnecessary fear or embarrassment. Over time, I realized that communication is not only about exchanging information. It is also about managing emotions. Every conversation contains both facts and feelings. Successful communication requires attention to both. Phrases like "no worries," "don't worry about it," and "that makes sense" help bridge that gap. They acknowledge emotions while keeping conversations productive and positive. Looking back, I am grateful for the many situations that taught me these lessons. Every delayed meeting, every forgotten task, and every unexpected problem became an opportunity to practice patience and understanding. Those experiences helped me become a better friend, a better coworker, and a better communicator. As my confidence continued to grow, I found myself becoming more proactive in conversations. Instead of simply reacting to situations, I started taking initiative. When challenges appeared, I wanted to help solve them. When tasks needed attention, I wanted to step forward and handle them. Gradually, my role in conversations began to shift from reassurance and understanding toward action and responsibility. And that naturally led me into the next stage of my communication journey. As I became more comfortable supporting people through mistakes and unexpected challenges, I noticed another change happening in my communication style. I was no longer focused only on understanding problems. I was becoming someone who actively helped solve them. The more experience I gained, the more confident I felt stepping forward when something needed attention. I discovered that communication is not only about listening, agreeing, or empathizing. Sometimes it is about taking responsibility and reassuring others that the situation is under control. One morning at work, I arrived earlier than usual because our team was preparing for an important client presentation. Everyone had been working hard for weeks, and the final meeting was only a few hours away. As people gathered in the conference room, there was a sense of excitement mixed with nervousness. We wanted everything to go smoothly. Unfortunately, just before the presentation started, one of my coworkers realized that several printed documents were missing. The room immediately became tense. People started searching through folders, checking desks, and looking around the office. My coworker looked overwhelmed and worried that the presentation would be delayed. Seeing the stress on her face reminded me of the situations I had encountered before. Instead of adding to the panic, I calmly said, "I got it." The phrase was short, but it communicated confidence. It told everyone that I was ready to help solve the problem. Without wasting time, I went to the printer room and checked the printing queue. A few minutes later, I discovered that the documents had been sent to a different printer on another floor. After retrieving them, I returned to the conference room and handed them to my coworker. She smiled with relief and thanked me several times. I simply laughed and said, "I've got this." At that moment, I understood why these expressions are so useful. They reassure people that someone is taking action. The presentation ended successfully, and the client was impressed with our preparation. Later that day, my manager thanked everyone for their hard work. She also mentioned that staying calm under pressure is one of the most valuable professional skills a person can develop. Her comment stayed with me because I realized that confidence is often communicated through simple language. Phrases like, "I got it" and "I've got this" send a powerful message. They tell people that they can rely on you. A few weeks later, I had another opportunity to use these expressions. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was helping my friend Emma organize a community event. Volunteers were setting up tables, arranging decorations, and preparing materials for visitors. Everything seemed to be going well until one of the organizers noticed that the registration forms were missing. Several people began discussing possible solutions at the same time. The conversation quickly became chaotic. Rather than joining the confusion, I stepped forward and said, "I've got this." Then I opened my laptop and checked the shared event folder. Fortunately, I found a digital copy of the forms. Within minutes, I had printed new copies and distributed them to the registration desk. The problem was solved before most visitors even noticed. Emma later told me that my calm response had helped prevent unnecessary stress. Hearing that made me realize how important confidence can be during unexpected situations. As time passed, another phrase became increasingly important in my professional life. That phrase was, "I'm on it." Unlike "I got it," which often emphasizes taking responsibility, "I'm on it" emphasizes immediate action. It tells people that you're already working on the task. It communicates urgency, efficiency, and commitment. I found myself using it almost every day. One particularly busy afternoon, my manager asked whether I could update a report before an upcoming meeting. The deadline was tight, and several sections still needed revision. Without hesitation, I replied, "I'm on it." Then I immediately opened the file and began working. My manager nodded and moved on to other responsibilities because she trusted that the task was being handled. That trust felt rewarding. It showed me that reliable communication helps build professional credibility. The phrase became even more useful during team projects. Whenever a colleague identified an issue that required attention, someone needed to take ownership. Instead of leaving responsibilities unclear, I often responded with, "I'm on it." The phrase eliminated uncertainty. Everyone knew who was handling the task and what was happening next. Clear communication made collaboration smoother and more efficient. Outside of work, these expressions proved equally valuable. One evening, my younger brother called me because he was having trouble assembling a piece of furniture he had recently purchased. He sounded frustrated and confused by the instructions. After listening for a moment, I laughed and said, "I got it. Send me a picture." A few minutes later, he sent several photos of the parts and instruction manual. After reviewing everything, I guided him through the process step by step. By the end of the call, the furniture was assembled correctly. Experiences like that taught me an important lesson. People often feel calmer when they know someone is willing to help. They do not necessarily expect perfection. What they want is reassurance that progress is being made. A confident response can provide that reassurance. It can transform uncertainty into clarity and anxiety into confidence. Of course, taking charge does not mean trying to control everything. It does not mean believing that you always have all the answers. Instead, it means being willing to step forward when action is needed. It means accepting responsibility and doing your best to contribute positively. Sometimes leadership appears in formal roles. Other times, it appears in small, everyday moments when someone says, "I've got this," and follows through. As I continued developing these habits, I noticed changes in the way people responded to me. Coworkers trusted me with larger responsibilities. Friends frequently asked for my help when planning activities. Family members relied on me during important situations. These experiences were not the result of extraordinary talent. They were often the result of consistent action supported by clear communication. Looking back, I realized that confidence is not something people are born with. It grows through experience. Every challenge that I faced, every mistake that I corrected, and every responsibility that I accepted contributed to that growth. The phrases, "I got it," "I've got this," and "I'm on it" became symbols of that development. They reflected a mindset focused on action rather than hesitation. However, even the most organized and proactive people cannot be available every second of every day. There are moments when a phone rings unexpectedly, when another urgent task appears, or when attention must temporarily shift elsewhere. In those situations, communication requires a different skill. Instead of taking charge, it becomes necessary to pause a conversation politely without creating frustration or confusion. And that lesson would soon become the next step in my journey. As my responsibilities continued to grow, I learned that being reliable did not mean being available every second of the day. No matter how organized I tried to be, unexpected interruptions were simply part of life. A phone call could arrive during a meeting. A coworker might need help while I was already working on something important. A family member could contact me in the middle of a conversation. Over time, I realized that one of the most useful communication skills is knowing how to pause politely without making the other person feel ignored. One morning, I was discussing a new marketing campaign with my coworker Sarah. We were sitting in a conference room reviewing ideas and making notes for an upcoming presentation. The discussion was productive, and we were making steady progress. Suddenly, my phone began to vibrate. Normally, I would ignore personal calls during work hours, but when I looked at the screen, I saw that it was my younger brother. Since he rarely called during the day, I suspected that something might be important. I turned to Sarah and said, "Hold on for a second." The phrase felt natural and respectful. It did not abruptly end the conversation. Instead, it let her know that I needed a brief moment before continuing. She nodded, understanding immediately. I answered the call and quickly discovered that my brother needed some advice regarding an urgent situation at work. The conversation only lasted a few minutes. As soon as the call ended, I returned my attention to Sarah and said, "Thanks for waiting." Then we continued exactly where we had left off. That small interaction reminded me how valuable a simple phrase like "hold on" can be. It creates a temporary pause without damaging the flow of communication. It tells people that you still value the conversation and intend to return to it. Another expression I frequently use is "hang on." In many situations, it serves a similar purpose. One afternoon, I was helping Emma plan a community event. We were reviewing a list of volunteers and discussing scheduling details. While we were talking, I remembered that I needed to verify an important piece of information. Instead of guessing, I said, "Hang on a second. Let me check something." Emma waited while I looked through my notes. Within a minute, I found the correct information and shared it with her. That experience showed me that pausing briefly can actually improve communication. Rather than rushing or providing inaccurate information, a short pause allows people to gather facts and respond more effectively. Sometimes the best answer begins with "hang on." It gives everyone a chance to slow down and ensure that the conversation remains accurate and productive. As useful as those phrases are, there are times when a slightly longer interruption is necessary. That is where another expression becomes important. "I'll be right back" is one of the phrases I use most often in both professional and personal situations. It reassures people that my absence will be temporary. Instead of leaving them wondering what happened, I clearly communicate my intention to return. I remember one particular afternoon when several coworkers and I were discussing a project deadline in the break room. The conversation was important because we were trying to coordinate tasks across multiple departments. Just as we were reaching a decision, I realized that I had forgotten a document at my desk. Rather than disappearing without explanation, I smiled and said, "I'll be right back." Then I quickly walked to my office, retrieved the file, and returned. When I came back, the conversation continued smoothly. Nobody seemed confused or frustrated because they knew exactly what was happening. That small phrase had managed expectations and prevented misunderstandings. I began noticing how often people appreciate clear communication during interruptions. Most individuals do not mind waiting briefly if they know what to expect. Outside of work, I use the same expression frequently. When friends visit my apartment, there are often moments when I need to answer the door, grab something from another room, or respond to a quick message. Instead of leaving abruptly, I simply say, "I'll be right back." It is a small courtesy, but it helps maintain a comfortable atmosphere. People feel acknowledged rather than abandoned. As my workload increased, I also found myself relying on another useful phrase. Sometimes I genuinely could not stop what I was doing immediately. There were occasions when I was focused on an important deadline, responding to urgent emails, or completing a time-sensitive task. In those moments, I needed a way to communicate that I was occupied without sounding rude. That is when I started using the expression, "I'm in the middle of something." One busy Friday afternoon, my manager asked whether I could review a document right away. Under normal circumstances, I would have started immediately. However, I was already finalizing a report that needed to be submitted within the next 20 minutes. Rather than pretending I could do both tasks at the same time, I replied, "I'm in the middle of something right now. Can I take a look as soon as I finish this report?" My manager appreciated the honesty and agreed. That conversation taught me an important lesson about boundaries. Being helpful does not require saying yes to everything instantly. Sometimes the most professional response is explaining your current situation clearly. The phrase, "I'm in the middle of something," allows people to understand your priorities without feeling rejected. It communicates that you are busy, not unwilling. I encountered a similar situation with my family one evening. My mother called while I was preparing a presentation for an important meeting the next day. I wanted to talk with her, but I also needed to finish my work. Instead of rushing through the conversation or ignoring the call entirely, I answered and said, "I'm in the middle of something right now, but I'll call you back in about 30 minutes. She completely understood. When I called her later, we were able to have a relaxed conversation without distractions. The more I practiced these expressions, the more I realized that effective communication is not about constant availability. It is about managing expectations respectfully. People appreciate knowing what is happening. They appreciate being informed rather than left guessing. Simple phrases like "hold on," "hang on," "I'll be right back," and "I'm in the middle of something" help create that clarity. Over time, these expressions became natural parts of my daily vocabulary. I use them during meetings, phone calls, social gatherings, and family conversations. They helped me balance multiple responsibilities while maintaining positive relationships. More importantly, They allowed me to pause without appearing careless or disrespectful. Looking back, I can see that communication is often about transitions. Sometimes we move from uncertainty to confidence. Sometimes we move from empathy to action. And sometimes we move from active participation to a temporary pause. Each stage requires different language, but the goal remains the same. We want people to feel informed, respected, and valued. Eventually, after stepping away from conversations and returning to them many times, I noticed another important aspect of communication. Daily life constantly places us around other people. We walk through crowded stores, attend meetings, share public spaces, and interact with strangers. In those situations, small acts of politeness can make a surprisingly big difference. Learning how to excuse myself, apologize for minor inconveniences, and politely decline things I did not want became the next chapter in my communication journey. As I became better at managing conversations, handling interruptions, and balancing different responsibilities, I started paying closer attention to another important aspect of communication. It was something much smaller than leading a project or solving a problem. Yet I noticed that it affected almost every interaction I had throughout the day. That aspect was everyday politeness. Whether I was walking through a crowded store, attending a meeting, taking public transportation, or spending time with friends, small expressions of courtesy seemed to make every interaction smoother and more pleasant. One Saturday morning, I decided to visit a large bookstore downtown. It was one of my favorite places because I could spend hours browsing different sections and discovering new authors. The store was especially busy that day. Families, students, and tourists filled the aisles. As I moved between bookshelves, I found myself needing to pass through narrow spaces where people were standing and reading. Instead of squeezing past silently, I would smile and say, "Excuse me." Almost every time, people immediately stepped aside and smiled back. The phrase was simple, but it showed respect. It acknowledged the other person's space and politely requested permission to move through. I realized that "excuse me" is one of the most useful expressions in everyday life because it helps avoid awkwardness before it even begins. Later that same day, I experienced another situation where the phrase proved helpful. I was waiting in line at a coffee shop when I noticed a menu displayed near the counter. Unfortunately, several people were standing directly in front of it. Rather than trying to look around them or interrupting abruptly, I politely said, "Excuse me, could I take a quick look at the menu?" They immediately moved aside and smiled. The interaction lasted only a few seconds, but it reminded me that politeness often makes requests easier for everyone involved. As I continued observing people around me, I noticed that even minor inconveniences can create tension when they are not handled properly. Fortunately, a simple apology can often resolve those situations immediately. One phrase I found especially useful was "sorry about that." Unlike formal apologies, it feels casual, friendly, and appropriate for everyday mistakes. One afternoon at work, I was carrying several folders while walking toward a meeting room. As I turned a corner, I accidentally brushed against a coworker who was coming from the opposite direction. The collision was minor, and neither of us was hurt. Still, I immediately smiled and said, "Sorry about that." My coworker smiled back and replied, "No problem." Within seconds, the moment was forgotten. That experience reminded me that small apologies can prevent unnecessary discomfort. Nobody expects perfection. People understand that accidents happen. What matters is acknowledging them respectfully. A phrase like "sorry about that" communicates awareness and consideration. It shows that you recognize the inconvenience, even if it was unintentional. A similar situation occurred during a team meeting a few weeks later. Heavy traffic caused me to arrive several minutes later than expected. As I entered the room, everyone was already seated. Rather than pretending nothing had happened, I quietly took my seat and said, "Sorry about that. Traffic was worse than usual today." My coworkers nodded, and the meeting continued without any issues. The brief apology helped maintain professionalism while keeping the atmosphere relaxed. As useful as apologies are, I eventually encountered situations that required a different skill. Sometimes communication is not about agreeing or apologizing. Sometimes it is about politely saying no. For a long time, I struggled with this. I worried that refusing an invitation or declining a suggestion might disappoint people. Because of that concern, I occasionally agreed to things that I did not actually want to do. Over time, however, I learned that honest communication is healthier than forced agreement. One of the most helpful expressions I discovered was, "I'd rather not." It allows me to decline something politely without sounding rude or confrontational. The phrase feels respectful because it focuses on personal preference rather than criticism. I remember one evening when several friends invited me to watch a horror movie. They were excited because the film had received excellent reviews. Unfortunately, horror movies have never been my favorite form of entertainment. In the past, I might have accepted the invitation simply to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. This time, however, I smiled and said, "I'd rather not watch a horror movie. Maybe we can choose something else." My friends completely understood. What surprised me most was how easily the conversation continued. Nobody seemed offended. In fact, another friend admitted that she was not interested in horror movies either. We eventually chose a comedy instead, and everyone enjoyed the evening. That experience taught me that polite honesty often works better than silent discomfort. Another example happened at work during a discussion about after-hours social activities. A group of coworkers planned to attend a late-night event during a particularly busy week. Since I already felt exhausted from several demanding projects, I knew I needed time to rest. Rather than inventing an excuse, I simply said, "I'd rather not stay out late tonight. I need some time to recharge." My coworkers respected the decision immediately. The more I used expressions like, "Excuse me," "Sorry about that," and "I'd rather not," the more confident I became in everyday interactions. These phrases helped me navigate crowded spaces, recover from small mistakes, and express personal boundaries respectfully. They allowed me to communicate clearly while maintaining positive relationships. What I found most interesting was that politeness is not only about following social rules. It is also about making other people feel comfortable. A thoughtful apology can reduce tension. A respectful refusal can prevent misunderstandings. A polite request can create cooperation instead of frustration. These small moments happen every day, and together they shape the quality of our interactions. As the months passed, these expressions became second nature to me. I no longer had to think carefully before using them. They appeared naturally in conversations with coworkers, friends, family members, and even complete strangers. Each phrase served a different purpose, yet they all shared the same goal. They helped create smoother, more respectful communication. Eventually, I noticed that once basic politeness was established, conversations often became much more interesting. People felt comfortable sharing stories, opinions, and experiences. Instead of focusing on social etiquette, the discussion could move toward deeper topics. The challenge was no longer starting a conversation or maintaining politeness. The challenge was keeping the conversation alive, showing genuine curiosity, and encouraging people to share more. And that would become the next step in my communication journey. As I became more comfortable with greetings, agreement, empathy, responsibility, interruptions, and everyday politeness, I started noticing something interesting. Beginning a conversation was no longer difficult for me. Being polite was no longer a challenge either. However, there were still moments when conversations seemed to lose energy. People would exchange a few sentences, and then an awkward silence would appear. I realized that starting a conversation is only one part of communication. Keeping it alive is an entirely different skill. The more I observed confident communicators, the more I noticed a common pattern. They were genuinely curious about other people. They listened carefully. They asked follow-up questions. Most importantly, they used small expressions that encouraged others to continue speaking. I decided to practice the same approach in my own conversations. One afternoon, I met my friend Emma for coffee after work. We had not seen each other for several weeks because both of us had been busy. After talking about our schedules for a few minutes, she mentioned that she had recently started learning photography. I knew almost nothing about photography, but instead of changing the subject, I listened carefully. As she described her new hobby, I smiled and said, "That's interesting." The effect was immediate. Her eyes lit up, and she became even more enthusiastic. She started explaining how she had been experimenting with different camera settings and practicing outdoor photography during weekends. I realized that my simple response had encouraged her to share more. It communicated genuine interest without interrupting her story. Sometimes people simply want to know that someone is listening. As our conversation continued, Emma showed me several photos she had taken. Some were landscapes, while others were portraits of friends and family members. I was impressed by how much progress she had made in such a short time. After listening for a while, I leaned forward and said, "Really? Tell me more." She laughed and immediately began sharing even more details about her learning process. That moment taught me an important lesson. Many conversations end too quickly because people fail to invite the other person to continue. Expressions like "really?" "Tell me more" act as an open door. They signal curiosity and encourage deeper discussion. Instead of stopping at surface-level information, they help uncover stories, experiences, and perspectives that might otherwise remain hidden. A few weeks later, I experienced something similar at work. During a team meeting, one of my coworkers presented a new strategy for improving customer engagement. The idea was different from anything we had tried before. Some team members seemed uncertain, while others remained quiet. As I listened to the presentation, I found several aspects particularly creative. When my coworker finished explaining the concept, I responded, "That's a good point." Immediately, the discussion became more productive. My comment showed that I had been listening carefully. More importantly, it encouraged my coworker to elaborate on the idea. Other team members began contributing their thoughts as well. The meeting transformed from a one-sided presentation into a collaborative conversation. I discovered that "that's a good point" is a powerful phrase because it validates someone's contribution. People often share ideas with a certain degree of vulnerability. They wonder whether others will take them seriously. When we acknowledge a valuable observation, we encourage further participation. We create an environment where people feel comfortable sharing their thoughts. The more I practiced these expressions, the more enjoyable my conversations became. Instead of feeling pressured to constantly talk, I learned the value of listening. Good conversations are not competitions. They are shared experiences. Sometimes the most important contribution is not providing information, but encouraging someone else to continue. One evening, I attended a small gathering hosted by a friend. Several people were discussing travel experiences. At one point, a woman I had just met mentioned that she had spent 6 months volunteering abroad. The statement immediately caught my attention. Rather than waiting for my turn to speak, I focused entirely on what she was saying. After she described a few highlights of the experience, I smiled and said, "That's interesting. Really? Tell me more." For the next 20 minutes, she shared stories about different cultures, unexpected challenges, and meaningful friendships she had developed during her travels. By the end of the conversation, I felt as though I had learned far more than I could have by talking about myself. That experience reinforced my belief that curiosity is one of the most valuable communication skills a person can develop. Another memorable example happened during a family dinner. My father was explaining a financial decision he had recently made regarding a property investment. At first, the topic seemed somewhat complicated. However, instead of losing interest, I listened carefully. As he explained his reasoning, I noticed several thoughtful considerations that I had not previously considered. When he finished, I nodded and said, "That's a good point." My father smiled and continued explaining the details. The conversation became much more engaging because he felt that his perspective was being appreciated. Moments like that helped strengthen our relationship. They reminded me that active listening is not only useful in professional settings. It also plays a crucial role within families and friendships. As the months passed, I became increasingly aware of how much people appreciate being heard. Most individuals have stories they want to share, ideas they want to explore, and experiences they want others to understand. They're often looking for signs that someone is truly paying attention. Simple expressions like, "That's interesting," "Really?" "Tell me more," and "That's a good point" provide those signals. I also noticed that these phrases helped reduce social anxiety. In the past, I sometimes worried about finding the perfect thing to say during conversations. Over time, I realized that I did not need to impress people with constant talking. Instead, I could focus on understanding them. Genuine curiosity often leads to better conversations than clever remarks. What surprised me most was how these small expressions gradually deepened my relationships. Friends shared more personal stories. Coworkers involved me in more meaningful discussions. Family members opened up about their thoughts and concerns. The more interested I became in other people, the stronger my connections grew. Looking back, I realized that communication is not just about transmitting information. It is about creating understanding. Every conversation offers an opportunity to learn something new about another person. Sometimes that learning begins with a simple phrase like, "That's interesting." Other times it begins with, "Really? Tell me more." Regardless of the exact words, the goal is the same. We invite people to share a little more of themselves. As I continued developing this habit, conversations naturally became longer and more engaging. People felt comfortable discussing ideas, opinions, and future plans. Eventually, many of those conversations led to decisions that needed to be made. Friends discussed where to eat. Coworkers debated project directions. Family members considered travel plans and schedules. In those situations, another communication skill became essential. It was the ability to remain flexible, share decision-making power, and avoid being overly controlling. And that would become the next stage of my communication journey. As my conversations became more engaging and meaningful, I noticed that many of them eventually led to decisions. Sometimes my friends and I needed to choose a restaurant. Sometimes my coworkers had to decide on a project direction. Other times, my family needed to coordinate plans for holidays or special events. In the past, I often felt pressure to have an answer immediately. I thought being decisive was always the best approach. Over time, however, I learned that effective communication is not always about leading. Sometimes it is about being flexible and allowing others to participate in the decision-making process. One of the first expressions that helped me develop this mindset was, "It depends." At first, I did not use it very often because I worried it might sound indecisive. Eventually, I realized that many situations genuinely depend on circumstances. Life is rarely as simple as a yes or no answer. Weather changes. Schedules shift. New information appears. In those moments, "It depends" is often the most honest response. One Saturday morning, Emma called me and asked whether I wanted to spend the afternoon at the beach. Under normal circumstances, I would have immediately said yes. However, the weather forecast predicted possible rain later in the day. Instead of making a firm commitment, I replied, "It depends on the weather." Emma agreed that waiting for more information was the smartest choice. A few hours later, the forecast improved and we decided to go. That simple conversation taught me that uncertainty does not always require complicated explanations. Sometimes it communicates exactly what needs to be said. It shows that a decision is connected to specific factors rather than personal preference. It keeps the conversation open while remaining honest and practical. A similar situation occurred at work during a discussion about a new marketing campaign. Several team members were debating when to launch the project. One coworker asked me whether I preferred an earlier launch date or a later one. After reviewing the available information, I responded, "It depends on the final budget approval." My answer reflected reality. Without the budget, it would have been impossible to make a responsible decision. What I appreciated most about the phrase was its flexibility. It encourages people to think about conditions and context rather than rushing toward conclusions. In many situations, decisions improve when people take the time to consider all relevant factors. Another expression that gradually became one of my favorites was, "It's up to you." I discovered that not every decision needs to be controlled by one person. Sometimes allowing someone else to choose is the best way to show trust and respect. When appropriate, sharing decision-making power creates a more balanced and cooperative relationship. I remember meeting Emma for lunch one afternoon. We had already agreed to spend time together, but neither of us had chosen a restaurant. After discussing several options, she asked where I wanted to eat. Honestly, I liked all the suggestions equally. Rather than pretending to have a strong preference, I smiled and said, "It's up to you." She appreciated the flexibility and selected a small cafe she had been wanting to try. The lunch turned out to be wonderful. As we talked and laughed over coffee, I realized that the specific restaurant had never been the important part. Spending time together was what mattered most. By allowing her to choose, I had reduced unnecessary discussion and made the planning process easier for both of us. I also found this phrase useful in professional settings. During team meetings, there are often situations where multiple options are equally acceptable. In those cases, insisting on a personal preference can create unnecessary complications. One afternoon, my manager asked whether I preferred presenting a project on Tuesday or Wednesday. Since either day worked for my schedule, I replied, "It's up to you." My manager appreciated the flexibility because it simplified scheduling for the entire team. Over time, I learned that flexibility is not a sign of weakness. In fact, it often demonstrates confidence. When people are secure in themselves, they do not feel the need to control every detail. They can adapt to changing circumstances and collaborate more effectively with others. The third expression that became increasingly important in my communication was, "I'm good either way." I particularly like this phrase because it communicates complete openness between two or more options. It removes pressure from the decision-making process and helps maintain a relaxed atmosphere. One evening, several friends and I were planning how to spend the weekend. Some people wanted to go hiking, while others preferred staying in the city and visiting a museum. Both ideas sounded appealing to me. When someone asked which option I preferred, I smiled and said, "I'm good either way." My response allowed the group to focus on finding a solution that worked for everyone rather than worrying about my personal preference. The same phrase proved useful during family gatherings as well. During one holiday, my relatives were debating whether to host dinner indoors or outdoors. Since both arrangements sounded enjoyable, I simply said, "I'm good either way." The conversation moved forward quickly because nobody felt pressured to satisfy every individual preference. As I continued using these expressions, I noticed an interesting change in my relationships. Conversations became more collaborative. Friends felt comfortable sharing their opinions. Coworkers became more willing to discuss alternatives. Family discussions felt less stressful and more cooperative. Instead of competing for control, people focused on finding solutions together. I also discovered that flexibility often encourages reciprocity. When you occasionally allow others to choose, they become more willing to consider your preferences in the future. Relationships function more smoothly when decision-making is shared rather than dominated by one person. Of course, being flexible does not mean avoiding all decisions. There are times when leadership is necessary and clear choices must be made. However, many everyday decisions are not worth turning into debates. Choosing a restaurant, selecting a meeting time, or deciding between two enjoyable activities rarely requires rigid positions. In those situations, flexibility can save time and strengthen relationships. Looking back, I realized that communication is not only about expressing ideas. It is also about creating space for other people. Expressions like "it depends," "it's up to you," and "I'm good either way" help create that space. They reduce pressure, encourage cooperation, and remind everyone that relationships are often more important than minor preferences. As the months passed, these phrases became natural parts of my conversations. Whether I was talking with friends, family members, coworkers, or new acquaintances, they helped me approach decisions with a more relaxed and collaborative attitude. I no longer felt the need to control every outcome. Instead, I focused on enjoying the process and working together with others. Eventually, after countless conversations, shared decisions, and memorable experiences, I noticed another important pattern. Every meeting, every discussion, and every gathering eventually comes to an end. No matter how enjoyable the interaction may be, there always comes a moment when people say goodbye and continue with their lives. I realized that ending a conversation gracefully is just as important as starting one. The final words people hear often shape the lasting impression they carry with them. And that realization led me to the final stage of my communication journey. As I reflected on everything I had learned about communication, I realized that every conversation follows a journey. It begins with a greeting. It grows through shared ideas, understanding, and cooperation. It survives misunderstandings through empathy and respect. It becomes stronger through curiosity and active listening. Eventually, however, every conversation reaches a natural ending. For a long time, I assumed that saying goodbye was the simplest part of communication. Over time, I discovered that endings matter just as much as beginnings. The way we end a conversation often determines how people remember it. A rushed goodbye can make even a pleasant interaction feel incomplete. A thoughtful farewell, on the other hand, can strengthen relationships and leave the door open for future connections. Once I understood this, I started paying closer attention to the expressions people used when ending conversations. One Friday evening, I met Emma for dinner after a particularly busy week. We spent several hours talking about work, family, travel plans, and personal goals. The conversation flowed naturally, and before we realized it, the restaurant was preparing to close. As we stood outside saying goodbye, I smiled and said, "Let's catch up soon." The phrase felt warm and genuine. It communicated more than a simple farewell. It expressed a desire to continue the friendship and create another opportunity to spend time together. Emma smiled and agreed immediately. A few weeks later, we met again for coffee. That experience taught me that goodbyes do not have to signal an ending. Sometimes they simply mark a pause before the next conversation. As I continued using this expression, I noticed how effective it was with friends I had not seen for a long time. Life often becomes busy. Careers, family responsibilities, and personal commitments can make regular meetings difficult. Yet a phrase like, "let's catch up soon," reminds people that the relationship still matters. It creates anticipation rather than distance. A similar situation occurred during a family gathering. Several relatives had traveled from different cities to attend a celebration. After spending the entire weekend together, everyone eventually began preparing for the journey home. As people exchanged hugs and farewell messages, I found myself saying, "let's catch up soon" several times. Each time, the phrase felt sincere because I genuinely hoped to see them again. Another expression that became important in my life was, "let's keep in touch." Unlike "let's catch up soon," which often suggests meeting again, this phrase focuses on maintaining ongoing communication. I found it especially useful when meeting new people or when circumstances made regular face-to-face meetings unlikely. One example occurred during a professional conference that I attended for work. Over the course of several days, I met people from different companies and industries. Many of them shared valuable insights and interesting experiences. By the end of the event, I had developed several meaningful professional connections. As we exchanged contact information, I often said, "let's keep in touch." The phrase helped transform brief introductions into potential long-term relationships. It communicated openness and continued interest. Several of those professional contacts later became valuable collaborators, mentors, and friends. Looking back, I realized that maintaining relationships often requires only a small amount of intentional effort. I also used this expression with a former coworker who accepted a position in another city. On her final day at the office, many people gathered to wish her well. We talked about future goals, career opportunities, and the challenges of moving somewhere new. Before she left, I smiled and said, "let's keep in touch." Over the following months, we occasionally exchanged messages and updates. Although we no longer worked together, the connection remained strong. As valuable as maintaining relationships can be, I eventually learned that meaningful communication also involves staying informed about other people's lives. This is where another expression became especially useful. "Keep me posted" quickly became one of my favorite phrases because it communicates ongoing interest in someone's situation. I remember a conversation with my younger brother when he was applying for a new job. He had spent weeks preparing his resume, attending interviews, and researching different companies. Naturally, he felt both excited and nervous. After discussing the opportunities available to him, I told him, "keep me posted." The phrase let him know that I genuinely cared about the outcome. Over the next several weeks, he regularly shared updates about interviews, follow-up conversations, and final decisions. When he eventually received a job offer, I felt almost as excited as he did because I had been part of the journey from the beginning. That experience showed me how powerful a simple phrase can be. It transforms passive interest into active engagement. I later used the same expression with friends planning major life events, coworkers working on important projects, and family members pursuing personal goals. Every time I said, "keep me posted," I was communicating the same message. I care about what happens next. I want to hear how the story continues. As the years passed, these farewell expressions became natural parts of my conversations. They helped me maintain friendships, strengthen family relationships, and expand my professional network. More importantly, they reminded me that communication does not end when a conversation finishes. Relationships continue to grow through ongoing contact, shared experiences, and genuine interest in one another's lives. Looking back on my journey, I can see how much I have learned. I started with simple greetings like, "how's it going?" and "what's up?" I learned how to respond positively, handle uncertainty, show empathy, take responsibility, manage interruptions, practice politeness, keep conversations alive, and share decision-making power. Each stage taught me something valuable about human connection. Yet, perhaps the most important lesson was not a specific phrase. It was the understanding that communication is a skill developed through consistent practice. No expression becomes natural after using it only once. Confidence grows through repetition. Fluency develops through experience. Meaningful relationships are built through countless small interactions over time. Today, when I meet someone new, I no longer worry about finding perfect words. Instead, I focus on being present, listening carefully, and communicating sincerely. I understand that every conversation is an opportunity to learn, connect, and grow. Some conversations last only a few minutes. Others develop into friendships that last for years. Regardless of their length, each interaction has value. As I finish sharing this journey, I find myself thinking about the people who helped me learn these lessons. Friends who shared their stories. Coworkers who trusted me with responsibilities. Family members who supported me through challenges. Every conversation contributed something meaningful. Every interaction taught me a new perspective. And so, just as every good conversation eventually reaches a natural conclusion, this journey reaches its final chapter as well. But rather than saying a simple goodbye, I prefer something warmer and more hopeful. Let's catch up soon. Let's keep in touch. And whatever exciting opportunities or challenges come your way next, keep me posted. Because the best conversations are never really over. They simply continue in the next chapter. Learning English is not about being perfect. It is about becoming more confident little by little every single day. Every new phrase you practice, every conversation you try, and every mistake you learn from brings you one step closer to speaking English naturally and comfortably. Remember, even native speakers use simple expressions in daily life. Fluency does not come from using difficult words. It comes from using the right words naturally and confidently. I hope today's lesson helped you feel more relaxed and motivated on your English journey. Try to practice these expressions again after the video. Repeat them out loud, use them in your daily life, and slowly they will become part of your natural speaking habits. Consistency is the key. Small practice every day creates big improvement over time. Thank you so much for spending your time with Easy Listening English. If you enjoyed this lesson and want more easy English stories, daily conversations, listening practice, and natural expressions, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new lesson. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment below about which phrase was your favorite today, and share this lesson with friends who are also learning English. Until next time, keep practicing, keep listening, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself. See you in the next lesson on Easy Listening English.